Welcome to week number 2. So we're going to talk about fluids, electrolytes, acids, and bases, where they come from, how you process them, and what happens when they go wrong. So kind of keep in mind the big picture, the input and the output. Where are you getting these electrolytes from? Where are you getting the acids and bases from, and how do you get rid of them when you have too much? And you always want to keep in mind that everything focuses on homeostasis. It's a perfect balance. What comes in has to come out. So when you eat foods, you drink water, when you make water through metabolism, you have to get rid of those things that you bring in through food and water and metabolism. So the main sources of bringing them in, we're going to talk about what you eat when you're drinking water, what's going on, it's kind of an obvious, and then metabolism, how you make water in your body. And then we'll also talk about the systems that are responsible for getting rid of water, like even in your feces, you have about 100 milliliters of water. Sweating, breathing, which we call insensible loss, and urine. So when you're looking at the different compartments, you want to think of why is the water there also. And the water is there for things like chemical reactions. We'll talk about the cell. We've talked already a lot about the cell last week. We'll talk about transportation. So think about the blood moving things through your body, and then also lubrication, like mucous membranes. So first I'm going to talk about the organs that help regulate fluids. And we always just go straight for the kidney, but it's not just the kidney. You have a lot of systems that are working together to make sure those fluids are moving through your system, going to the right places, helping to keep them in and helping to get rid of them. So the first system we'll talk about is the one that brings it in primarily, and that's the GI tract. So its main goal is to absorb fluids. And every day, of all the fluids that are in your body, you're bringing in about 900 milliliters from food and 1,500 milliliters from drink. When you're using the GI tract to get rid of, remember, the last step of the GI tract is the large intestine, so it's going to absorb most of the water. You're only getting rid of about 100 milliliters of water through the feces. So it's not a perfect balance for the GI tract, which means you have to have another system to get rid of water somewhere down the road, which we'll talk about. Of course, the kidney. When you think about the GI tract, I always think about it in two parts, the upper and then the lower. So the upper part's primary purpose is actually secretion, pushing things out into what we consider the external environment. So keep that in mind. As you're pushing enzymes out, like pepsin and pepsinogen, hydrochloric acid, all these different chemicals you're pushing out, you're pushing fluids with them. It's all because of osmosis, which we'll talk about in the next slide, but as you're pushing any kind of solute in one direction, the water will naturally follow it. So as you're pushing fluids from your blood into the GI tract and you vomit, you lose lots of water if you do that. Down in the bottom half, this is for absorption primarily. So it's bringing solutes in. And of course, if it's bringing the solutes into the body, where's it moving the water? Also into the body. So I like to think of these two different areas about what the main processes are. Water is moving into the GI tract through the top. It's moving out of the GI tract to the bottom. So if you start vomiting, you keep losing water, you keep donating more water, which causes things like dehydration. And we'll talk about acid-base balances at the end here. And then down here, if you have diarrhea, you didn't get a chance to reabsorb the water, so you lose lots and lots of fluid. So like I said, we're going to talk about osmosis now. When you bring those solutes in, the water naturally wants to follow it. When you lose the solutes, the water naturally wants to follow it. So osmosis just simply puts diffusion of water. And if you remember the term diffusion, it always means things move from high concentration to low concentration, and that's diffusion. Diffusion is also what? Active or a passive process? Diffusion is a passive process. There's no energy required. It moves based on the molecular energy of that molecule itself, like the water. So the water is always wobbling around, bouncing all over the place. It takes its own energy and moves around in space. You don't have to put any energy in making it spread out. It just naturally does that. Until it hits what point where both sides are exactly the same? That's equilibrium. So when these things are moving by their own force, their own movement, they'll keep spreading out until they're both equally distributed on both sides of the membrane. That's what they want to do. Right? In fact, they'll keep pushing to be where they want until they can push the water out of their way. So this is an old classic YouTube experiment where they'll take water and put it on both sides of the tube, and they have this semi-permeable membrane down the middle. And what they do is if they put a higher concentration of solute over here, if it's a high solute, that means it automatically has to be a low solvent, which is water. So the water looks where there's more or less water at. If there's a lot of water on this side comparatively, and there's very little water on this side comparatively, the water naturally wants to go to where there's less water per unit. So if there's a liter here and a liter here, and this liter only has 5 particles and this liter has 10 particles, that means the remaining part of this has to be water, right? So if we say that this is 95% water, and this is 90% water as a result, the water naturally wants to go from 95 down to 90. So it's kind of a rule of thumb. This is the understanding. This is the physiology, or actually the physics behind what's going on with water and osmosis. But the rule of thumb is that wherever there's more solute, that's where the water wants to go. Because anywhere there's more solute, that means there has to be less solvent, which means water is always going to be lower in that high solute area. So what's interesting about this is the water will keep pushing, and it's trying to make it so that it's in equilibrium. So it's trying to get it so that they're both sides are exactly the same. And the water will actually force the other water particles up through the tube. But there's going to come a point where there are other forces that are trying to stop water. And one of those forces is called hydrostatic pressure. So for instance, hydrostatic pressure is trying to push back down on the water and stop the water, hydrostatic pressure. Another force is called oncotic pressure. And oncotic is referring to the particles, the solute particles. And that's what I meant by water wants to go wherever their solute's at. You can always think of a solute as being kind of like a water magnet or a water sponge. It always attracts the water. So if there are 10 pieces of solute on this side and 10 pieces of solute on this side, which side is more powerful in attracting water? They both are. They're actually equilibrium, so the water's not going to move. But if there are only 5 water magnets over here, or solute particles, and 10 water magnets, or solute particles over here, the water's going to be more attracted to the side where there are more of those little particles. So again, there are a lot of ways you can look at it, but osmosis is diffusion of water. It's water moving from its highest concentration to a lower concentration. Or you can think of it as wherever the water concentration is lowest, that's where the solute has to be highest. And I'm going to point this out a couple times, but the primary solutes that are driving osmosis in the body are actually going to be things like proteins, salts, and sugars. And those are the 3 big ones you want to watch. And of course I'm saying that because you want to watch out for diabetics, because diabetics have lots of sugar. So if they have lots of sugar in their blood, where's the water going to want to go? Into or out of the blood? If there are lots of solute or little water magnets in the blood, they're going to be attracted to the blood, which is going to raise their blood pressure, which is going to make them want to get rid of more water, which makes them urinate more frequently. And we'll talk about that pathophysiology too. All right. Just one example of how disease can actually cause osmosis to change. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more in infection too, but the reason I'm putting this in here is because you want to try and keep in mind the themes. So what are the themes that are happening? And in cholera, just one theme that happens is cholera goes into your intestinal tract. So you drink it from dirty water that people have been urinating or defecating in, or that there's some kind of, some way that bacteria is getting in, and the bacteria itself is actually Vibrio cholera. But this bacteria is in it. And we talked about this just a little bit with John Snow, the first real epidemiologist in London, where he found out that the well was contaminated with some kind of pathogen. He didn't exactly know what was going on at the time, but there's some kind of pathogen in there. And so he took the well handle off, or pump handle off, and people got better. And what's interesting about cholera is the best treatment for cholera is actually clean water. But they weren't getting clean water. They were constantly drinking dirty water, so they're just recontaminating themselves. So anyway, this cholera gets into the water, it gets into your GI tract, and it replicates. And what it does is it goes along the wall of your GI tract, and it doesn't infect you. It doesn't go into your tissue. So that's the interesting thing about cholera is cholera doesn't want to go into your blood. It just wants to go into your GI tract. And while it's in the GI tract, it starts causing pumps to turn on that start moving sodium into the GI tract. And sodium is going to be chased by chloride that goes into the GI tract. So if these are solutes going into the GI tract, what does water want to go? Remember, solutes are water magnets. They want to pull. So they pull the water into the GI tract. And now you have all this extra water in your GI tract that you can't absorb. So what's going to happen? What's going to be an obvious sign? Diarrhea. Yeah, they're going to have way too much watery diarrhea. Now, the bacteria can actually irritate the stomach lining and cause things like nausea and vomiting too. But you want to watch this diarrhea because most of the people that have it that are going to die because of the fluid loss from diarrhea. So you can see it's still a problem. About 10,000 to 120,000 people die every year. The incidence about 3 to 5 million cases. And if you notice, the prevalence isn't on here. And that's because when you're talking prevalence, you're talking about how many people are alive at a certain time, and usually it's over a year. Well, when you get cholera, you either get rid of cholera within a couple weeks or you die within a couple weeks. So it's not something that you have as a chronic situation where it lasts for a long, long time. So if you were to figure out the pathogens or look at the pieces, you can see that the bacteria gets in you, it releases a toxin that causes the solutes to be excreted. So the intestines excrete solutes. They push the solutes out here like chloride, sodium, bicarbonate. And then what's water do? Osmosis causes water to chase the solutes. So the solutes come out, and then you can have your obvious symptoms. So diarrhea, the key symptom. And you can see the pathway here. And the reason I'm pointing this out is not because cholera is so important you have to memorize it right now, because cholera is more prominent in like third world or underdeveloped countries right now. But when you look at how this process works, you can apply it to other things like lactose intolerance. It's not a bacteria, but they have lots of solute in their GI tract. Lots and lots of the sugar, lactose, they can't process. So what's water going to do? Water is attracted to the solute, which means it gives them what symptom? Diarrhea. The same pathogenesis. It's just a different type of disorder. But it's the same concept. Same thing with anthrax. Anthrax gets in your GI tract and it causes vomiting, diarrhea. Anthrax, you can apply the same principle to other organs too. Anthrax gets in the lungs and it creates this toxin in the lung wall and it causes you to start pushing fluid, mucus, and lots of water into your lungs. So basically you're drowning in your own lungs. But it's the same process that's happening. You can just apply it to different diseases. Next system is cardiovascular, and obviously cardiovascular is there to distribute fluids, so bring the fluids around the body. The key points with cardiovascular you want to remember are the filtration and the reabsorption. So cardiovascular, it's one thing to just carry the fluid through the body, but you need to do something with it. So one of the processes is filtration. You bring it down to the capillary beds, you push the fluid, you push the nutrients out because it's high pressure, and then after you push the nutrients out, or shifted nutrients, we'll just say that, then you're going to reabsorb the extra things. Whatever the blood's low in concentration, it'll reabsorb and bring it back and around into the heart. So in the example, I'm actually pointing over here at the pulmonary circulation. So here you have blood flowing out. This blood's low in oxygen, goes to the capillaries, and since it's low in oxygen, it starts pulling the oxygen in. But what's it high in? It's high in CO2. So it's going to push the CO2 out into the lungs and get rid of it. So it pulls this fresh oxygen in, circulates to the body, and then shifts that high oxygen in the blood out to the tissues, picks up the high CO2 and carries it away. So filtration and reabsorption are kind of the key themes here. And I always look at it kind of like this pump, like a pump for your house. If you have a well, I grew up where there was a well, so this is why I always think about this, but the water's pulled from way, way, way deep, gets pulled all the way up, and then like if we use it on a sprinkler system or we use it on whatever, we had a sewage tank too in the backyard, so that water would go through our house, we'd use it for whatever we needed to, and it would flush naturally down through the toilet. You don't have a pump in your toilet to push it down, it just pulls by gravity, right? So it pulls it back down into the well, and then it slowly starts seeping back down, I said the well, back down into the sewage tank, and then it starts seeping down into the underground streams, and then it could potentially go back to your well. It's the same process with the body. It's just this pumping in one direction that naturally flows back in the other. Pumping in one direction naturally flows back around again. It's kind of an interesting pathway when you think about it. And here are the four forces you absolutely have to know. And we'll talk about these a lot when we talk about edema again too. But it was called Starling's hypothesis. And Starling's hypothesis had those four forces. 2 filtrations and 2 reabsorptions. So there are 2 forces that push fluids and substances out of the blood. They're being filtered out of the blood. And then there are 2 forces that pull things back into the blood. And where you want to think about this primarily is on capillary beds. So on the capillary beds, you have high force coming into the capillary bed that helps push things like water, nutrients, oxygen out. It's forcing these things out into the tissue. They get used by the tissue, and now it's low pressure on the other side of the capillary. That low pressure just seeps right back in and carries things back to the heart. So the forces you want to pay attention to, you've got capillary hydrostatic pressure, which is your blood pressure. The first words usually tell you where it's coming from. So capillary hydrostatic means water forcing, or it's the pressure in the capillaries is forcing stuff out of the capillaries. So it's filtering, pushing out of the blood. And then the interstitial osmotic. This is the interstitial tissue, so space between here. This would be the colloids, like proteins. It would be salt that's out here. It could be sugar that's out here. It could be anything that's out here that's pulling the water. So both these forces are pulling out of the blood. And then they get used, they get processed, and then they can seep back into the blood through reabsorption. So reabsorbing is pulling back into the blood. So you can think of the proteins in the blood are going to try and pull water back because they're little tiny magnets. There's also, as you put water out in the space, it starts swelling up and filling. So now that pressure is going to push the water back into the blood and carry it away. So 4 forces. You can apply this again when you look at the kidney too. So here's your afferent arteriole carrying the blood in. As that blood comes down through the glomerulus, it's high pressure in this situation. There are lots of little tiny leaky pores through here, so it leaks the fluid out. So that high pressure pushing this way. And then as this Bowman capsule starts swelling, it's going to try and push the water back in. So that's opposing filtration, or you can think of reabsorption as trying to push it back in. And then overall, when you look at the kidney has to have an overall filtration force. So you have to be filtering or taking things out of the blood in the kidney primarily. And I have a question for you to look up in just a few slides here on this. But the force is going to pull out, and of course you're filtering, you turn into filtrate, and you urinate it out. Now remember, when you're filtering things at the glomerulus, proteins shouldn't get through because proteins are too big. You filter based on size primarily here at the kidney. So you don't have to worry about proteins being in here, but what about sugar? What about sugar getting in here? So sugar creates this oncotic force, or this osmotic force. So when sugar gets into the Bowman's capsule, it's like a little water magnet. What's it going to do? It's going to pull water in. So who are you thinking about with sugar being inside the nephrons? I'm hoping diabetics. So as the sugar comes in, it increases the oncotic force or osmotic force in this Bowman's capsule, or glomerular capsule is another term for it. So the more sugar you have in here, what's going to happen to the water? More water comes in here. As more water comes in here, what's going to happen to your urine? You're going to increase the urine. You're going to put sugar in the urine, so sugar's pulling the water along. They urinate more, they lose more sugar, but they also lose more water. So how do diabetics feel? They feel kind of dehydrated. They feel constantly thirsty, so they're constantly trying to get more water inside. So it's kind of an interesting process when you understand it, and we'll talk about diabetes later too. But first, let's do question number 1. And this goes over actually what I spilled the beans and talked about, but now you're just going to put in writing how this works. So in diabetes, changes in blood glucose have a huge impact on the body. So we're just going to look at the nephron, but you can think of the same idea at the tissues too. So when glucose, and these little stars represent glucose, levels rise in the blood, how does that affect water movement between the cells in the tissue and the blood? So where's the water going to want to move? Right, so does it cause the cells in here to shrink or expand? What would it do? Think about how you just described the water movement. Where's water going? What's water chasing? And if water's chasing something, it has to be leaving another area. So what's going to happen to these cells? Right, so you have lots of glucose here. And then remember, the glucose can slip over this filtration membrane. So that's the next part. So now you have lots of sugar inside this glomerular capsule, or Bowman's capsule is another way to say it. What's going to happen to the pressures? And I want you to describe to me what's happening to the oncotic pressure. So oncotic pressure. And then what effect would that have on the diabetic's urine? All right, pause, write this question down. It's question number 1. And I kind of inadvertently answered it on the last slide. So if you need to go back and listen to that, go ahead. All right, next is the urinary system, and we've been leading kind of into this, but with the kidneys, you really want to think about the key players. What does the kidney use to affect fluids? And the first thing it's going to do is it's going to affect things like the plasma levels of fluids. So let's say you have a lot of fluid in the plasma. If you have way too much fluid in the plasma, what do you want to do with that? You want to get rid of it. So the kidney is going to start filtering more out. The next thing you want to think about is if you have lots and lots of flow going into the kidney, what's going to happen to the speed? So if you have lots of flow coming into the kidney, what's going to happen to the speed of the water, the filtrate, moving through the nephron? It's going to speed it up. And then when you think of the filtration rate, if you're speeding this flow through here, you're going to filter more and filter more and filter more, which means what's going to happen to your urine volume? It's going to go up. What's going to happen to the substances in the urine, like salt or potentially sugar? That'll go up too. The faster you push blood through the kidney, the more urine you're going to make and the more solutes you're going to lose. So there's another player. And then you want to think about this last step of the nephron, the distal and the collecting ducts, and how they're under the influence of ADH, which is also known as vasopressin, and aldosterone. And hopefully you remember these two things. They both work on the collecting duct, but they work on two different substances. So aldosterone is responsible for what ion? Sodium. And ADH, antidiuretic hormone, is responsible for what? Water. Two different things, but they kind of have one theme in common. Aldosterone tries to do what with salt? Get rid of it or keep it? tries to keep it. It's pulling salt in. Just by that piece of information, what do you think that water is going to want to do when you pull salt in? You pull water in too. But ADH needs to be present because ADH makes those little water pathways. It opens up those little aquaporins for water to flow through. So they work together, and their main goal is to raise the plasma volume. They're trying to bring the volume of the blood back up. They're trying to reabsorb salt and water to make your volume higher. They also affect urine concentrations. So if you turn on a lot of aldosterone channels, so aldosterone goes down to the collecting duct, turns on these little sodium-potassium pumps, it's going to start bringing in lots and lots of sodium. It's going to make your concentration of your urine a little bit different. So think of the key players. And on the next slide, I put pretty much everything you have to remember, or I found a slide that summarized pretty much everything you have to remember about the kidney and the processes. But I'm just going to walk through this real quick with you. Just think, if your blood volume were to drop, so your fluids in the plasma drop, what's going to happen to the size of the afferent arteriole here? So you have low blood volume. What do you think should happen to the afferent arteriole going into the glomerulus? It should decrease. What's that going to do to the flow? It'll decrease the flow. What's that do to the filtration rate? If you turn on the flow going into the glomerulus, what happens to the filtration? You get less filtration, which means you hold more things in the blood. And at this point, if you have low blood volume, do you think you're going to have more ADH or less ADH? Low blood volume, what do you want to do? You want to rise the blood volume or raise the blood volume. So you release more ADH to pull more water in. What do you think you're going to do with aldosterone? You have low blood volume, low blood pressure. You turn on the aldosterone. So now, not only are you pushing less substance into the kidney, but you're actually absorbing more water and more salt. What's going to happen to your urine overall? Will you have more urine or less? You'll have less urine. What's going to happen to the concentration of the urine? Think about it. If you're pulling lots of water and salt out, all the other substances like urea, bilirubin, things like that, those are still in there. What's going to happen to your urine? It's going to be more dilute or more concentrated? More concentrated. So you can see this process actually without knowing every step of the pathogenicity. But if you have low blood volume or low blood pressure, you're going to make overall at the very end less urine because you're retaining more, and you're going to make it more concentrated or more dark. And like I said, this next slide here, I found this, and the link is down here if you want to check it out, and they walk you through everything too. But you should actually be able to step through this and look from the afferent arteriole, remember the wider arteriole coming into the glomerulus, to the Bowman's capsule or glomerular capsule. Remember, most of the products are reabsorbed right here in the proximal tubule. You can see the concentration of the urine, and it becomes more and more concentrated. So it becomes more, in my mind, darker and thicker. You're pulling more and more water out in the descending limb of the Luca-Henle, down in the medulla. Going back up, you're starting to pull solutes out, like sodium and chloride. You can't move water over here. And when you get to the distal tubule, this is where you have the pumps that are sensitive to aldosterone, and the little pores that are sensitive to ADH. So you can see you can adjust how much concentration you have here before you put it in the collecting duct, and then to the renal pelvis, to the bladder, and out of the body. So this is a really handy slide, and if you want more physiology review, you can go to that website. It's really a good website. All right, nervous system. So nervous system, you really need to think about the pathway here too. And nervous system always depends on receptors. So the receptors get triggered, and there are two major types of receptors that help you regulate fluids in the body: osmo and baroreceptors. And what does osmo refer to? Hopefully we've been talking about it enough that you know. It's talking about, right, osmosis. So it's talking about water concentrations. It looks at the concentration of the water. And what it's looking at is there too much salt, or is there too little water, or vice versa. So it's looking at concentrations, not volume. You can have 1 liter of water, or actually 2 little jars of 1 liter of water each, and they can be totally different concentrations. It's not looking at the volume, it's looking about the concentration. So one might have 10% salt, where another one has 5% salt. Osmoreceptors detect that concentration of the salt or the water. And then baroreceptors are actually what are detecting volume, but they're not doing it by the volume itself. They're doing it what the volume does to the pressure on the walls of the blood vessels. So baro is referring to pressure. Baroreceptors detect pressure, and you want to think blood pressure. So baroreceptors, hopefully you remember, they're in the aortic arch and the carotid sinus. They're there to help determine the pressure coming out of the heart and going into the head. osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. So we're going to look at the hypothalamus first. The hypothalamus, of course, in the brain, right above the pituitary, right below the thalamus. Hypothalamus has well, you probably know all the purposes of the hypothalamus, the 4 Fs, freezing, feeding, fighting, fornicating type of purposes. But the osmoreceptors in here are very sensitive to water concentrations. So in this situation, if your osmoreceptors detect an increased osmotic pressure, they can flip on, and they're going to try and start changing the release of chemicals. And the primary chemical you want to think of is ADH, antidiuretic hormone. So those osmoreceptors can actually send signals that go all the way down to the adrenal glands and release norepinephrine too, but we'll talk about that in a second. So first, ADH, antidiuretic hormone. ADH comes out, it goes to the kidney and causes you to retain water. So if you have too much salt, it causes you to start retaining more water to dilute the salt. What's that do to your blood volume now? It takes your blood volume up and it's going to raise your blood pressure. ADH is also known as vasopressin, which goes to the blood vessels and causes the blood vessels to vasoconstrict, raising your blood pressure. Right, since we're talking about fluid, we're going to look at primarily the kidney throughout the next several slides. Right? But the hypothalamus is a key player. Hypothalamus doesn't just release chemicals. Remember, it's also part of the nervous system, and it can do psychological effects. So one of the psychological effects is it makes you thirsty. So if you detect that you have a lot of salt in your blood, you're going to try and get rid of salt, you're going to try and retain more water, and you're going to try and absorb more water. So you turn on thirst. You get thirsty, you drink water, the water is absorbed across the GI tract, goes to the blood, and it dilutes the blood. Unfortunately, it brings the blood pressure up, so then what organ is going to have to get rid of that extra water? Right, the kidneys. Right? So it's a process. You can see that all of these organs are interrelated. While we're talking about things like ADH, hormones, let's look at the endocrine system and its role. So the primary roles we're going to talk about with the endocrine system are going to be, like we just said, ADH. ADH from the hypothalamus going down to the collecting duct of the kidney, causing it to retain water, changing the osmotic pressure in the blood. The other main player, and you definitely want to have stars by it, is called the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. And I know you've seen this, and I know whoever your physiology teacher was beat it into your head how important it was. But it's super important to know. So the main hormones we're going to talk about, actually as we go through fluid and electrolyte, are going to be ADH, antidiuretic. And whenever you see this, you should automatically think, what other name for ADH? Vasopressin. Yep. So vasopressin. They're the same chemicals. They have very similar purposes. Actually, they have the same purposes. It's just with ADH, you look at what it does on the kidney, as when we call it vasopressin, we look at what it does to the blood vessels. Right, we're going to talk about renin, released from the kidney. Renin, of course, you should know the pathway. It's on the next slide, so I'll walk through it. So renin is released from the kidney. Aldosterone, that's released from what organ? So aldosterone was one of the 3 key steroid hormones that were released from the adrenal gland, and specifically the adrenal cortex. And we'll talk about these later, but remember, cortisol and DHEA were the other 2 main players from the cortex. And then we'll talk a little bit about natriuretic hormones. And natriuretic hormones tell you what they do. They look like diuretic, right? Natriuretic. But they start with Na+, or I'm sorry, NAT. I did that on purpose. So Na+, I'm trying to trigger in your mind that this is affecting sodium. So these are diuretics, basically. They're trying to help you get rid of sodium. There are 2 major ones. There's ANP and BNP. And it's interesting because I always think of these as protectors of their organs. So they're kind of like the safety hormone. But ANP is released from the atria of the heart when you have what? Low blood pressure or high blood pressure? If it's a safety protector, ANP is released when you have high blood pressure. It's trying to save the heart. It goes down to the collecting duct and makes you start losing sodium. What's going to chase the sodium out into your urine? Water. So in other words, ANP is released because there's too high blood pressure. It goes to the kidney, it makes you lose salt, and the water is going to chase it, making your blood volume go down, which makes your blood pressure go down. BNP is the same thing, brain natriuretic peptide. This is for the brain. When the brain is experiencing high pressure, it'll release this chemical to help you get rid of sodium. Water chases it, bringing your blood pressure down, reducing the pressure in your brain. And then, like I said, the key pathway you really want to make sure you never forget is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, because this has a huge impact on blood pressure. So a lot of drugs out there for people with high blood pressure are affecting this system. So the pathway is the kidney detects that you have very low blood pressure. It releases this chemical called renin. So renin goes through the bloodstream, and renin's looking for something that's already in the bloodstream. It's looking for angiotensin and ogen. And angiotensinogen is an inactive enzyme that's made by the liver. So the liver had already put it out here. It's just a protein that's floating through the blood all the time. When this angiotensinogen gets activated, angiotensin 1, it's actually not doing very much. It's still flowing through the system. It's still a protein, but it's not active yet. So it has to go all the way up to the lungs where it meets something called angiotensin converting enzyme, or we call it ACE. And then that ACE turns on angiotensin 1 and angiotensin 2, and that's when it hits the fan. So angiotensin 2 is an extremely powerful blood pressure increaser. And it does it, I call it really powerful because it does this in lots of different ways. So angiotensin 2, one thing it does is it goes straight to your blood vessels and starts constricting them. So it's raising your blood pressure. Another thing it does is it'll go all the way down to the kidney and starts helping you to retain or raise your blood pressure by retaining water and salt. Not exactly the same process as aldosterone and ADH. But angiotensin 2 will also go up here to the top of the kidney to the adrenal gland and release aldosterone. And of course, what's aldosterone do? Aldosterone goes to the kidney and makes you retain salt. So it goes and helps you retain salt. It goes to the hypothalamus, makes you thirsty, which means you're bringing in more water, adding it to the blood, raising your blood volume, raising your blood pressure. It stimulates release of ADH at the hypothalamus, which goes down to the kidney, causes you to retain water. So there's lots of processes, and every one of these processes of angiotensin raises the blood pressure. So all of these processes are spiking your blood pressure. If you have high blood pressure, what's a good chemical to turn off? Would you want to turn off just the aldosterone? Maybe just the ADH? No, what you do is you go all the way to the root. You're going to try and stop this angiotensin 1 from converting to angiotensin 2, so they give you an ACE inhibitor that shuts this off and adjusts your fluids and your electrolytes based on that. So definitely know all the key players in the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And then the last two organs I want to talk on briefly, which we don't give much credit to, but they're really important, is respiratory and integument system. So respiratory system, when you're thinking about fluids, how would you lose fluids through your lungs? I mean, you don't usually we think lungs fluid, and that's a bad thing. But when you're losing fluid through the lungs, you do it through what we call insensible loss. You're breathing, you're exhaling, and you're blowing water out at the same time. So you can see this when it's a cold day and you walk outside and you see all those little condensation particles that are in the air as you breathe out, because you're blowing out water vapor as you breathe. So if somebody that's breathing really heavy, what are they doing to the fluids in their body? Increasing them, keeping them the same, or actually losing them? They're losing them. So somebody that's breathing really heavy is going to lose more fluids. You can think the same idea with the integument system, so sweating. So sweating is actually considered one of the sensible losses. So we sweat to keep cool. When you sweat, though, excessively, like excessive exercise, or this guy that's apparently under a lot of stress, you lose more fluids that way. And when you lose more fluids, you have to remember you lose electrolytes too. So you lose water and sodium and potassium and chloride, urea, all kinds of stuff. So if you're exercising really hard and you're bringing pure water in, you're actually doing yourself injustice. You should be bringing in electrolytes at the same time. Right? And then you'll see this word diaphoresis, and it's just talking about excessive perspiration. So I put it in there because we'll see it again and again. So the next question is, using all the receptors, organs, and chemicals we just talked about, list how the body would regulate your extracellular fluid water after exercising. So not immediately after exercising, after you've relaxed. So you've already sweated all this stuff away, you've been breathing really hard, blowing out these chemicals or this water, and now what's going to happen? So here's the pathway. I gave you the kickstart, and then you just have to finish it. So you can use your textbook or whatever you need to. You can go back and look at the slides. But so you're sweating. It causes plasma volume depletion, which activates what kind of receptors? So when your plasma volume goes down, what kind of receptors? Where were those receptors located? So I'm giving you a hint. Here's the nervous system. What receptors? You might want to go to that slide. Where were they located? And they trigger thirst. Right. And then where do those hormones, chemicals go? So where do the chemicals go? And what do they do to help you replenish that? I'm trying to help remind you of a feedback loop. So you start because you have depleted water volume, which means your volume's low, which means your pressure is low. I'm trying to think of a way to say that without giving it away. But so you have a drop in blood pressure. In other words, your volume dropped, your blood pressure dropped, and now you finish the pathway. Pause here, write it down, write the answers. And then the last couple slides here. So the cell can regulate water And there's no specific organ I'm talking about. I'm just saying every cell in your body regulates water. You get a lot of water that's produced by metabolism. So you have about 400 milliliters of water every day that you just make by being alive. You generate it. When you look at this process of taking sugar and oxygen, sending it through what organelle? The mitochondria, right there. Sending it through the mitochondria, you make ATP, about 36 ATP altogether. You make carbon dioxide, which you breathe out, but you'll also make water, which you can also breathe out. You're making all three of these things at the same time. You're also generating heat too, which I should have put in here. But the cell is constantly making water, which means the cell has to get rid of water, right? So here's the mitochondria. You can see this process. It's written right here. Taking it, and remember it's oxidative phosphorylation. You're making your ATP, your CO2, and water. That water could expand the cell. Okay? It can make the cell swell and pop, so it has to be able to get rid of it. But the cell needs water. It can't be just a dehydrated raisin. It needs water to keep all of the gears in place. I remember I used that analogy last week. So all the gears have to line up. It has water in there to help keep the gears lined up. And I always think about that because biochemical reactions need a little space to work. If you shrink them down, they don't work very well. We do this with cells, like bacterial cells. When we want to kill them, we can shrink them down by pulling the water out, and then they can't, their clock pieces don't line up, and they can't go through biochemical reactions, and they die. We also need that water to help dissolve certain substances. It will help it dissolve things like salt. We help it when we try and break apart sugar. And then it helps maintain temperature too. So these are all important functions, or necessary functions. And then here's just an example of what could go wrong. So what's the intracellular effect of fluid accumulation? And we talked about this the first week. So what happens if the cell accumulates too much water? When you look at the process, so here you have too much water coming in. There's your vacuolation, the little water particles. Remember, it makes things swell. So it's going to make things like the endoplasmic reticulum swell. It's going to make the mitochondria swell. It starts swelling. And this picture over here is an example of a mitochondria. And this is in a cardiac muscle. And I'm going to point out something I think is really cool. But you can see the swelling. So the cristae isn't nice and organized anymore. It's just kind of scattered and shattered all over the place. A lot of times you'll see it line up around the outer membrane. But it's not working. What I think is really cool is here are the muscle fibers in the background. You can see the mitochondria. As it's swelling, the muscle fibers are all intact. And as it starts dying, look what happens to the muscle fibers. So the muscle fibers are starting to fall apart too. You've got some blebbing from the mitochondria, the vacuolation here, but the muscle fibers are starting to dissolve in the background. And then you can see they just get worse back here too. So they look really bad. And this is because what's happening is the mitochondria is swelled, all the particles on the inside start falling apart and ripping, and then they don't work anymore. So it starts shriveling up and dying. And why, of course, would mitochondria be a problem? So once the mitochondria swell in the cell, and they die, what's going to be a problem for the cell? It can't make ATP. So no ATP means no pumps, which means it can't pump sodium out. So sodium comes rushing in. What's sodium bring with it? More water, which causes more swelling, which is basically just a positive feedback loop. So the mitochondria failure because of water prevents you from pumping water out or moving water out, which means water keeps flowing in, making the situation worse. So always think down to a cell level. And this last slide here, the big picture of homeostasis. I talked about several organs, and these were refreshers to make sure you remember the importance of the organs in fluid and electrolyte balance. So when you look, no matter what the organ is, you have a lot of key themes that happen. So let's go through. The organ's out of sync. You're decreasing your urine. You're trying to hold the fluids and electrolytes in. So your urine becomes more concentrated. You start losing some weight because remember, you're still breathing. You're still losing water. You still sweat. You lose water. Your feces is still holding some water in. You start getting really dry membranes, dry skin, warm, hard, and cracked. Whatever organ that is, what's interesting is that homeostasis is going to try and keep a balance. So I listed off several organs. If only one's out of sync, what are the rest going to try and do? They're going to try and fix it. So if it's something like the heart, let's say the heart's not working efficiently. It's not pumping efficiently. What's the brain going to think of that? Oh, what the heck? Don't worry about it. No, the brain's going to freak out. It's going to panic, and the brain's going to try and squeeze the blood vessels to push the water through. So it says, forget it, heart. If you're not squeezing the heart, then I'm going to squeeze the blood vessels and try and pump with the vessels. When you start thinking a little deeper, what's the kidney going to do? The kidney retains the pressure to try and hold that water in, or retains the water, so that it starts pushing the fluid back to the cells and rehydrating the cells. The lungs, what would they start doing? they're going to start trying to breathe a little bit faster to get more oxygen in. And then, of course, your blood vessels, if your heart's starting to slow down, your blood vessels in your skin are going to start constricting and try and push that blood back to the heart. So you can actually see this homeostasis. So when one starts shutting down, the rest start picking up the difference. So when you're looking at what's the organ that's causing the problem, you kind of take a roll call. You see what are the organs that are important for maintaining this thing, whatever it is, if it's blood volume. And if you start looking, whatever organ is missing or not doing its job is probably the one that's to blame. So if you start seeing the sympathetic nervous system's constricting, the skin's becoming pale, okay? This person's breathing a little bit faster, they're not urinating. The only organ that's not doing a job to try and compensate in the situation is the heart. So that's usually the organ you're trying to look for. And it's just kind of a game you want to try and figure out. So it's persistence. It's all about taking your time, but being consistent and trying to make sure you carry the entire job out. And I love this little phrase, now that we've exhausted all the possibilities, let's get started. And so once you've exhausted all of the organs that aren't doing the problem, let's focus on the one that's missing. You can stop, do those couple homework questions, and then we'll catch up on the other one.